Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Many of you have joined our program over the years and realize when it comes to midlife, sometimes the confusing waters of loneliness seem to be creeping in. But the question is, how long has that actually been happening? When did it start? And what were some of the obstacles and pretenses that brought you to this place where you felt lonely? After all, loneliness is a lot more than just that physical being of being alone. It's also a feeling of separation, shame, or fear that goes with the connection process to form and get people to feel be able to feel the feeling of being connected to others. On the program today, we're going to be joined by someone who's created a movement known as the Principle of Authenticity. It's an ideology behind authenticity movement that in today's fast-paced modern world is built on pretenses instead of authenticity. When the world is built on pretenses, our guest says, the truth of a person and the truth of the world cannot emerge in order to be known. She has her newest book, which is The Anatomy of Loneliness, How to Find Your Way Back to Connection. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Teal Swan. Teal, thank you for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me. It's wonderful.
Now, tell us how you began to start, emerging this idea of loneliness. I mean, we can really see it very prevalent, especially with technology and how everybody seems to be more connected to their handheld devices to a point that you can't even seem to hold a conversation without people having anxiety about the fact that, boy, you're starting to really pry in and make me feel a little more uncomfortable. I'd kind of like to click out of this conversation like they're becoming more used to in social media.
Mm-hmm. Well, really, it was just the fact that I myself struggled with isolation and this feeling of loneliness my whole life. And when you're in that space of loneliness, you feel like you're the only one that feels that way. You're sort of looking at the world and looking at people hanging out with each other and going, well, I guess everyone else can connect and not me. But when I got into this work of being this, personal transformation revolutionary, kind of traveling around the world and meeting people on every different continent, what completely blew my mind is that this is a universal issue. It didn't matter how, quote-unquote, popular somebody seemed. They all had the same story for me. So it's like behind closed doors, everyone's saying I'm lonely and nobody will understand me, but it doesn't look like that in the outside world. So I was like, I got to get to the bottom of this, if this is something that all people are experiencing. So I went into a 3-year shamanic journey to actually try to understand loneliness at its roots. And so that's what got me into this.
Now, it's pretty fascinating how a person becomes led into their work, and it seems that you have certainly had this motive of experience in your own life. And I know certainly as I was looking through your book, The Anatomy of Loneliness, I began to really see and sense some questions emerge as I realized the truth of what you were writing about here. And found it quite amazing now. Probably like you, and I can't say exactly like you, and like you said, a lot of us, in fact, probably most of us experience that feeling of loneliness. I realized, most of my life I always felt like that person, even being someone who was popular, liked, accepted, whatever the case may be, there was always a feeling that I was on the outside looking in. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about if people have that experience, even for the listeners out there. Where do you think that actually comes from?
I think it comes from the fact that most people live in parallel perceptual realities. You can see this beginning in childhood. One of the common examples that I love to give is that the experience that a child has when they're the firstborn child and the secondborn child is brought into the family is akin to if your spouse walked through the door today and said, actually, I found somebody who I am also in love with, and because this is a new relationship, I'm going to have to focus on that more, and she's moving in with us, and so basically deal with it, and you should be lucky because you have more love, in your life, more people to go around. And we, as adults, because it's normal to have, multiple children, we don't actually see what's happening through that emotional lens. So it's like the perceptual reality that the child is experiencing is completely different than the perceptual reality that the parent is experiencing. And it's not just isolated to childhood. This continues on through adulthood. When we experience something, we experience it through the lens of our subjective perspective. And that is a profoundly isolating experience. So we can feel the difference between the reality someone else is living in and the reality we are living in. So it creates this basically a parallel dimension, but within the same room, which is what makes it so incredibly isolating.
Well, speaking of isolation, too, you talk about, for instance, there was the home, especially if you're firstborn, such as I was, or even secondborn, and you realize that in most families there's at least 2 to 3 children, and there's that feeling of separation, as you were just talking about, of the fact that, well, now we got your baby brother or sister in, you're going to need to help us take care of him or her. You've got responsibilities, so what your wants and needs are seem to kind of take a back seat to this new person that's now in the life. Now, putting that aside, then we move into school. And if anybody like, I know definitely I was one of them, goes to a public school, boy, that really gets crazy there, doesn't it?
Oh, my gosh.
So I take it you've had that experience.
Oh, that's an understatement. I was so incredibly scarred by school that I can't put my son in traditional school. I actually cannot force myself to do it. So, yeah, it was really, 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 really bad. And I mean, the modern day school system is focusing on children in a way where it's not about the individual. It's literally, let's create a model that fits person into the mechanical structure of the society we want. And if they don't fit into that structure, then we don't know what to do with them. So it's actually, we're not capitalizing on the individual potential of each child. I realize it's difficult to do when you got 30 kids per classroom, but there are people who are figuring out ways to do it differently, thank God.
I know just recently I was in Southern California, Los Angeles, where I spent, some time, I want to say, in fact, I was taking my wife to different areas that I grew up in, and showed her 3 different schools that I went to before we actually left Southern California for the Northwest. And going back, I kind of smiled as I was looking at each of these places, but I didn't realize in retrospect, actually in 2 of those 3, the third one being the final place that I went to before I left to the Northwest, that if anybody had my experiences in these 2 schools, they would figure, well, this seemed to be kind of some horror stories there. And to give you an idea of one of the second to the last school is being simply sent to the principal's office, where I went into the nurse's office and laid on a bed for a day, literally from 9:30 in the morning until 3:30 when school got out, without not having any idea why I was there. But I do know that after that first experience, the principal says to me, if you cause any problems in your classroom tomorrow, back on that bed you go. And this began to happen regularly. Now just imagine you're sitting in that nurse's office for an entire day as you hear the lunch bell going on, the recess bell going on, and you're in this place. Nobody else is at you. Can't leave. There's no one to talk to. Eventually they felt that I was so unmanageable that I could only go to school for half a day. But yet I smiled as I went to each of these 3 places saying this is where I went to school at. And I thought to myself, how did I ever navigate and get through all that without just being a lot worse off than I felt that I was? Yeah. But that feeling like you're talking about as we were talking about public schools. And it's funny if people would just take a moment to realize that's when, to me, some of the worst things in our lives actually happen when it comes to what we're talking about here today.
Yes, for sure. And my school experience was a horror film, to say the least. That sense of isolation was there. I was the exact opposite in that I wanted to comply to everything that somebody said because I was so terrified of punishment. But I was the straight A student who had absolutely no emotional relationships with any other person and was dying in my personal life, but nobody really cared. They only cared about performance.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about, for instance, the emotional components that might have a person find themselves leading to what seems to be loneliness, that sense of, I'm on the outside looking in. A lot of it is about conforming, and when you're not able to do that, it seems that you find yourself in situations like that.
Yes. Well, in childhood, this whole thing starts in childhood. In childhood, we learn that we're only going to be able to be close to somebody if we are a certain way. I mean, you just basically described that in not so many terms when you were talking about your school experience. if I don't behave XYZ, if I don't excel at XYZ, if I'm not a certain way, then I'm going to be stuck in that nurse's office. So our way of creating social control has made it so that we believe it's not possible to be connected to society unless we alter ourselves in some way. This is a huge issue because we are a social species. As a social species, the number one priority for us and the number one source of safety is our sense of connection. And most people in adult life, we forget this because we feel like we're quote-unquote independent when we're really not. We're no different than a deer and no different than a pack animal. Our survival is based upon our connection to the social group, and so deep in our survival mechanisms that are embedded in your nervous system is the deep drive for connection. That's why people will let themselves go. That's why they will be inauthentic, because I have to be in order to survive, basically. And so this sets in this whole dynamic where you have to disown parts of yourself and deny parts of yourself in order to exaggerate opposite parts that will get you received in public. But when we're doing this, we can't completely eradicate them from our being. So it's almost like we know deep down in our souls that we're not entirely truthful, and there's this pressure that comes with social interaction. When I'm around people and I'm inauthentic, I feel this, it's almost like this tension in the body because you can't be free and easy. You have to be watching yourself 24 hours a day. And so a lot of people will prefer to actually go isolate because of the pressure of that inauthenticity. You know, they can't be relaxed and be themselves. So when we're around people and we're playing this act of inauthenticity, it's like we have a mask on, and so people are only ever relating to the character that we're showing them. And it's impossible for us not to feel some sense of isolation and loneliness if a person's in a relationship with a mask instead of whatever's behind it.
You know, you bring up, or something's beginning to emerge here that I think the listeners really should be attuned to here, and that is especially the phenomenon of being in America. And so as you were talking about individualism, and you go back several decades to, let's say, the 1950s, post-World War II, and you take a look at how, for instance, television definitely was really beginning to get legs. There were more televisions that were becoming available to people that could have them in their homes. And when we look back on the 1950s, some people might think about, for instance, television show Happy Days or American Graffiti, which were actually shows that happened in the 1970s. And the idea, as you were talking about, I've said this many times to people, I said, we're actually herd or pack animals. We actually need each other to survive and to thrive, just no different, as you were saying, from, say, horses or deer. And when you take a look at what was celebrated in these shows, it was about teenagers who were trying to find their own voice and become independent from society, you know, to actually be them, you know, to be individual. Now, being that said, now let's take a look at also, well, what supports television for you to watch these programs or you go to movies is the idea how the world of advertising and marketing has very, let's say, intelligently, if you want to call that a word in this particular realm, has created the anxiety for what this ideal looks like, and we buy into it. Many years ago, that being said, I remember being in a class that taught a lot about advertising, and I began to study quite a bit about this, and I realized, you know, they're right about this, and the question was asked, how many decisions do you make per day that are actually decisions you make sincerely about what you want or need or move you into the direction you really want to move or need in? And you'd be really surprised how often you do it in the name of not being criticized or trying to belong. And these are all, you know, as I said, with wit put in there for you to have that kind of anxiety to move in that direction. You know, and take a look at reality TV. It's really doing quite a number on quite a few people.
Yeah, it makes me sad because I feel like with technology, I mean, there's no way to make it go away.
No, that's true. In fact, it seems people are being birds with these contraptions in their hands.
I know. Yeah, my 9-year-old son knows way better what to do with my computer than me. It's super embarrassing. Because this stuff is not going away, I feel like there's this huge opportunity for conscious media. That's the direction that I'm going to continue to go in, and pretty aggressively here in the next few years, because there's such an opportunity when people are so keyed in there to actually have the opposite impact from what we're describing and what we're experiencing, where people can, think they're being entertained only, but actually a lot of these, let's call them teachings around personal growth, can be embedded in the nature of the entertainment itself. So I've got some hope that that's the way that this is all going to trend. But yeah, I mean, that whole thing you were saying is completely accurate, and how the media and the way that advertisement is angled makes this concept of pretense and inauthenticity, and do this so that you can avoid a consequence instead of really being yourself, is so embedded into our persona. It's been really interesting, actually. I went around the world, and I've been eating in every different place. I'm kind of a foodie, and when people in America describe the food that they have sentimental attachments to, it's always relative to a company. So it'll be like, Snickers, or it'll be something like Fritos, or it'll be like a chain like Taco Bell, And this is the positive associations that we're having because of the power of marketing, especially in America, whereas it's not the same in the rest of the world. People aren't like saying that their sentimental foods are related to some sort of corporation. So, I mean, it's very powerful what you just said.
And it's funny, too, because there's a Russian family out of the Northwest that actually gets people to move in the direction of being, more natural as far as their food selections, going raw, things like that. And they have a lot of website that's a lot of fun, especially when it comes to information and learning things like how to make, really great, let's say, energizing smoothies, for instance. Mm-hmm. And they had this fun little test on there where they were showing things such as particular trees, leaves of trees, a particular flower, so forth and so on. And right next to it, could you identify, for instance, what tree does this leaf come from? What is this particular nut, so forth? And then the next thing below that was actually, what do you want to call them, emblems, for instance. And they were saying they were astounded that 80% of the people that took this test could accurately guess most of the, call them emblems, if you will. I'm trying to think of the right word, the branding symbol, if you will. Mm-hmm. But could not accurately identify anything that was found in nature.
Yeah. God, it's sad. That's a super sad comment. So there we go again, isolation. We're not just disconnected from each other, we're disconnected from the earth itself.
And a lot of this, you talk about in your book, especially with internal separation, the idea of meaning. Let's talk about that a little bit, how we try to use meaning to identify with everything that goes on in our world. And sometimes this can kind of be a real trap, couldn't it?
Oh, yeah. Well, human beings are meaning-making machines. We have to derive meaning out of everything. It's something that actually sets us apart from very many species on the planet today. But that meaning can either be what saves us or what destroys us. So if I go through an experience, it's up to me what I make that mean. And you can see this different perceptual realities are composed of these different meanings that we assign to experiences. I can go through something, and the meaning I can assign to the experience is I am worthless, whereas another person could go through the same experience, and the meaning they can assign to the experience is, the universe is providing me with an opportunity. And how we see the world through that lens of meaning completely alters the relationship we have to life itself and to that event. And life is relationships. So the relationship I have to some event that I experience dictates the way that I emotionally cope with that experience, dictates how my body processes the trauma of that experience. So it drastically alters absolutely everything about the way that we perceive our life. So we need to be looking at the meaning that we assign to experiences, and we don't look at meaning often in terms of subjectivity. We think that it's objective. So we think that our subjective meaning that we're assigning to an experience is actually an objective idea. Everybody thinks their subjective perspective is objective, but it's not.
Yeah, and if you want to be tested on this, listeners, how many of you watched the news, and could you tell me exactly what it was that was said? I remember I actually had a guest on the program. He says, do you know why people watch the news? And I enlightened me, and he says, well, because we want to support our biases.
Yes.
And the funny thing is, you bring up something fascinating, going back to advertising and marketing again, as you say that let me kind of rephrase what you said in a way, but it's pretty much the same thing as, when we begin to go and do something that doesn't make sense, to give you a good idea on this, smoking cigarettes. or let's say binge drinking, or even using drugs, we have rationalization that supports the reason we do this that to us makes sense. And that's exactly what marketing tries to do, is to get you to that place that you rationalize a behavior that you normally wouldn't do.
Yes. Oh, yes, this is totally the case with addiction. You can see this in alcoholism especially, clearly, because alcoholism is so prevalent in the world today, where a person is spending years and years justifying why, or assigning different meaning than the actual reality to why they can drink in this particular experience. Oh, because it's 4th of July. Oh, because I had a hard day at work,
Oh, because it's NASCAR. The Super Bowl is around the corner, Well, rationalize yourself out of jail because you decided to drive home after that Super Bowl party. Does that work for you?
Yes, exactly.
And it's crazy because we also have come into a world, especially I feel in the last 30 years, of people getting to that point. Who knows where this message really comes from? It could be from living in your family and having to take care of younger siblings. It could be, for instance, the experience I shared about being in school. But whatever the case is, you begin to find this now yearning, this sort of voice in your head that says, something must be wrong with me, so how do I fix this? And the self-help movement, although it's been around for about a century or even many centuries, but in the last 30 years or better has been capitalized on people that have found intrinsic ways to be able to extract you from your money. Spiritual teachers and gurus seem to be on the rise here.
Yes, in a big way. Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, I love the idea that I love the idea of people who are actually trying to do good in the world, making money. But I also have an issue with people who can't afford it not being able to access the information. This is funny that you bring this up, because this has been such an issue in my own career. I'm like, gosh, I've got people like, I started this series, Ask Teal, and this series is where I do about 20 to 30 minutes of pure content telling people how to get out of patterns. And I have had at least over 20-something specialists now in the field of marketing and in the fields of business growth tell me that I've got to stop offering free content. Otherwise, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot, and my business is going to end because nobody's going to pay for content that's for free. So I've been in this major fight, basically, for the last, let's say, 7 years about the fact that I refuse to sign on to that methodology. And I feel like it's really important for us to find ways to, create an income, but that doesn't make it so that people can't get their hands on this information. It's super important for people to get their hands onto.
Yeah, I completely can feel for you there, especially when it comes to that, Teal. But, here's the thing, is I remember a time when I was wrestling with that same thing. And I finally thought to myself, if these people really desire the change they say they desire, you put money to that and they will make a commitment. So it was a way of changing my thinking about the whole process. I know that I'm doing whatever it is, let's say in my case I do media, and I do it from a place that sincerely wants to bring out information that's useful. Now, if I just go and I spend all my time giving this to people, and certainly we always hear about, the free giveaway, things like that. Maybe that's the other thing we bought into, too. We feel guilty if we don't give somebody at least a sample of something, to be able to buy into what it is we're really trying to offer. And an example of that, I remember doing a trade show some years back, and where we were promoting our radio program, and sitting next to us was a booth where they were doing homemade chocolate. Some really good quality stuff, actually. And so I looked over and I looked at the setup and I thought, these people are going to have a weekend of frustration, as they had a table laid out in front of the glass display case with samples. And the worst thing you can do at a trade event show is offer anything for free. Because what you got is a lot of freeloaders and what they call trick-or-treaters that show up just for that reason alone. They could care less about what it is you got, as long as you got something there like a free pen or a free cup or a free shirt, whatever it is. They're going to go, they're going to snatch it, and done. So as the show's going on for the first half day, I finally look over and I ask the wife, I said, so how are things going over there? And with a look of frustration, she says, you know, these people come right up. They don't even want to hear it. They just snatch the candy into their hand and they just walk off.
Mhm.
And I said, now, let me ask you, what was your goal here? And she says, well, we would like to sell candy and get people interested in what it is we do. And I said, really? Okay. I said, well, if that's your goal, then let's do this. I want you to pull that table away that's giving all the way the free samples. She says, really? And I said, well, don't you think they want to taste it first? And I said, no, because there's no commitment to it. You're giving it to them. Why should they buy anything from you? And she said, really? You know, and you could see it was kind of settling with her a little rough there. I said, just do this. I said, now, if they're really interested, here's the different thing. If you hand them a free sample of something they want to try, subliminally you just created a commitment connection. In other words, now they feel obligated to buy something from you.
Mhm.
And if they don't buy anything, you can certainly bet they're going to leave feeling pretty darn guilty that they didn't. But most likely they're going to buy. So I left for a while, and a couple hours later I came back, and she looked and she says, thank you so much for that suggestion. We've been selling this stuff off the hook. And I said, don't you feel better about it? She says, but I feel a little more guilty. And I said, okay, well, that's fine, but let's take a look at how much time and work did you put into creating this? And you just wanted to give this away to free to people you don't even know, or would you rather have them coming into your shop? See, it's a matter of changing, again, your meaning or your truth about what it is you do. And I can see how you, especially in the work that you do, can feel sometimes that confusion. But does that make sense?
Oh, of course it does. Yeah, I mean, that perspective is something that I've definitely looked at very, very deeply. So I'm doing a lot of stuff that's different around that. So what did you want to know about spirituality relative to this loneliness aspect? I feel like I sort of drug you away from the original question.
No, not really, because the idea with the spiritual teachers is a lot of times you said that it becomes difficult because people maybe can't afford what they're doing, and in many cases it could be really good work, but there seems to be a lot of self-proclaimed spiritual gurus, people that are now more often becoming shamans, and the idea that these people can become dangerous, especially when it comes to the process of you becoming connected and authentic and how you navigate those waters.
Oh gosh, this is like I could write a Bible on this topic. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people are actually using self-help and spiritual methodologies to drag people away from their authenticity. And it just becomes
creating their own personal cults, in other words. And this is why I wanted to bring this up.
One thing that drives me the absolutely crazy, of course, being an authenticity teacher, is the fact that spirituality, I mean, it's actually worse than mainstream society. In mainstream society, if somebody gets mad, it's like, you know, maybe you're a jerk, but like you haven't failed entirely as a human being. You know, and you get into the spiritual field, and it's like you get angry one time. Like, failure is an understatement of the century. Like, you literally cannot a higher standard. You can't be held up to a higher standard. And so I see bypassing. People cannot admit to the way they actually feel, and thus they can't be in real relationships on the fact that they hold themselves up to this completely false persona of false enlightenment, you know, walking up to you and saying, I feel no anger, you know. I'm completely not human. It is used as a way to transcend one's humanity, and so our physical embodiment can't even be in relationship because we're not allowing it to be. It's driving me nuts. So, yeah.
I know it's pretty crazy because when you think about the whole thing, they end up taking you to a level of more isolation and loneliness. And, you know, you have to get to that point to ask yourself this question. How, first of all, it's identifying, how do I know that I feel lonely? Well, obviously the feeling that you may have, and how do you change that? For instance, coming back to loneliness, most people, again, think of the idea of the physical of being alone. But let's take a look at, for instance, family. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that don't fit into the hallmark idea that at Christmas, you know, the aunts, the uncles, cousins, and brothers and sisters all got to come together for a nice warm Christmas. Or I know there's a show on TV, I think it's called like Blue Bloods or something like that, where it seems every Sunday this generation of family of people that work in law enforcement get together and have that Sunday dinner. And you look at this going, wow, you know, I don't know too many families that do this. And you think, what have I missed here? But let's just say there was a time that actually happened in your life. but somehow you kind of drift apart, which life just does that. But then you feel I've become so disconnected for so long. How do I recreate that intimacy and move back into it? What has to happen there, do you think?
Well, the first thing that has to happen is we have to be brave enough to be authentic, because only then can our sphere begin to clear out. What I mean by that is if we're living in an authentic way, people are in a relationship with a fictional character we're presenting to the world. And so we will never not be lonely if that's the case. And so the first step is this very brave step of being able to begin talking your own personal truth, which then puts other people around you in your physical reality in a space where they have to question whether they want to be around the real you or not. And I realize it's terrifying. There's nothing more terrifying for a human being than to lose their social group, but that opens up the space when those people vacate for people who are signing up for the real you, and then you can actually begin the process of genuine intimacy. Now, what intimacy is to see into somebody, to feel into someone, to hear into them so as to completely understand them. That's intimacy. So we should be developing this with everybody in our life, regardless of whether they're children, parents, siblings, partners. And we begin that process of really seeing into their feelings. And our connections, when we begin to do this, deepen, 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 deepen. So it's this process of attuning that needs to take place.
And that's where you also talk about courage, because it takes a lot of courage to finally strip away and to actually be who you really are. And I think a lot of us actually, as you were saying earlier in the program, tend to cover that up because we feel ashamed of certain things. For instance, you may have failed at something in your life, and there's shame in that, so you build a story around that perhaps being different. For instance, rationalizing, let's say, why you were fired from a job, or why you were one of those one out of every two couples who become divorced. Why that didn't work out. I hear this, I remember back in the day when I used to actually work in hospitality, and you'd see first dates and all the rationalization this potential couple would give each other about why their past relationships didn't work.
Oh, yeah.
And it gets pretty crazy, some of the things that you hear.
Yes, it does. It's sad. I mean, I'm hoping to create a society where it's safer to be vulnerable. But, so far it seems to be that we feel as if when we're vulnerable, we're just going to be met with instantaneous rejection, obviously, because we've been learning that over and over and over again. But part of what I'm trying to do with my authenticity movement is to create at least, I want to create a ripple that again goes out into the rest of society, but I want to create a group of people who have the space or can make the space for people to be in the space of authenticity, even when what we're being authentic about is something that most people would judge as bad or wrong.
So let's describe how, for instance, and all of us have felt shame at one time or another, how we can begin to stop feeling that, because that's also one of those obstacles that cause us to feel that isolation and loneliness as well.
Okay. Well, first, shame is not an emotion. Shame is a biological affective reaction, much like fight or flight mechanism. What it is the one we need closest to the person we're being rejected by, and so what we do is we turn against ourselves. So this process of fragmenting within our consciousness is created specifically by shame. Shame is basically the mechanism for that internal fragmentation where we split off from parts of ourselves. If somebody rejects an aspect of us, we push that aspect away within ourselves, but we can't obviously physically do that, because if I take out part of my body off, I'd die. But we can do that in terms of our consciousness. The mind can split. So we split ourselves in two, and then we split ourselves off in 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. We basically create a rift between what we identify with and any part of ourselves we don't want to have be a part of ourselves. And we can't create separation internally with any part of ourselves without likewise feeling the sensation of isolation. So it's like if I push you away from me as a person, now you are isolated and I am isolated. I can't push you away without making myself alone. And so if I'm pushing a part of myself away, I will register that loneliness that part of me feels within my own body. So the more fragmented you become and the more shame causes you to push aspects of yourself away, the more lonely you will be. So overcoming shame is about taking the exact opposite approach than we do in modern day society. In modern day society, we want to become one thing by pushing another thing away. So it's like, I want to become loving and get rid of the part of me that's angry, but that creates shame, actually. So the antidote to shame is totally counterintuitive. It's to look at the angry part of self and actually bring it closer as part of me. When I'm doing that, what I'm doing is looking at the needs of that aspect. I'm looking at what it wants. I'm starting to think about its interest, as if it's a separate being within me, almost like a Siamese twin, which is what I'm putting forth in this book. And by doing that, I'm no longer rejecting that part of myself. So by bringing it closer to myself, it no longer feels the isolation. So I and my body no longer feel that isolation.
You know, and I know one of the things as you were talking about that, that aspect of ourselves where, for instance, we may have felt we have done something wrong, and the fact is, wrong is actually a perception, unless it obviously causes harm to someone else. But, the justice system is a perfect example of shame just raining down.
Oh, my God.
No, I know, it was funny because I remember going to court one time over something real small. You forget to, for instance, renew your tag, but as you have to wait for your turn, you get to see some pretty crazy stuff there. And one of them, I remember, was this teenage girl who apparently the parents were allowing to get into this habit of wrecking really nice newer cars. And I think she was there for a speeding ticket or something like that. But what was astounding was the judge taking a position to act like mom and dad. Listen, young lady, you need to man up, and I was like, your job is to apply the law, not your opinion about it. But just seeing how much she could stick it to this young girl, it's like, look, if her parents are stupid, let them worry about that, because you guys are just collecting the money. But it's amazing what they do.
Oh, yeah, just don't even get me started. Justice system is actually myopus. That's what I'm wanting to change more than anything else on the planet today. Because the same way that we approach these parts of ourselves that we have judged as bad or wrong and then push them away from ourselves, and then that enhances the separation and makes the whole situation worse, this is what we're doing with the people in society. It doesn't matter whether they're homeless or whether they're criminals or whether they're XYZ. When we determine that somebody's bad, we push them away from ourselves instead of bring them closer to ourselves, and that's when the negative expression of those very people starts to ricochet out throughout society. So it's the pushing away of a person that creates the person who shoots up a school building. It's the pushing away of a criminal when they're in jail that makes it so that they get out. There's no way to come back into society, and so they go right back in. So this is it's a revolving door that is based on shame. And so until we're able to transform the way that we deal with each other and stop shaming each other and stop having our correctional facilities based on a model of shame, we will continue to see jails overrun, we'll continue to see crime on the planet, we'll continue to see war, we'll continue to perpetuate all of the things that create the most amount of suffering on the planet. So it's a serious focus for me.
Now, I thought this would be, as you would call that, this would be one of the pillars of isolation and loneliness, and that is shame, is to bring that up, because when you take a look at the fact that America incarcerates more people than any other place on planet Earth, and you realize that subliminally and subtly they've created this problem in the first place, as we were talking about earlier, through marketing and advertising. Now, people might say, don't you think you're a bit of a conspiracy theorist? Okay, you've heard the term keeping up with the Joneses. How often do you sit in your living room as you're flipping with your remote control thinking, boy, I sure wished I could have had that? Or I actually, and this is a true story, I was actually talking with a young man. I think he was about, and I had to ask him how old he was when he was talking to me and telling me the things that he was telling me. He was 26 years old, and he had this look of just frustration and sort of like, I kind of want to just give up. And I said, what's going on here? I see that you kind of seem troubled lately. What's up? And he says, I really just thought I'd be a lot further along in my life than I am. And I said, talk to me about this. What's going on? And he thought he should have been further along in a career, perhaps earning better money. I mean, there were all these things, and you could see right away, as what we're talking about here, there was a shame that he didn't reach this imaginary, I guess, goal that seems to be set out there for a lot of us. And I found that, and I was that way too as I was approaching a couple of weeks before turning the age of 30, that, wow, I thought I'd be further along in life than I am. And I thought, now in retrospect, as that came and passed, I realized, well, wait a minute, I've done a heck of a lot in my lifetime, and I felt good. And every year since then has been fantastic, because you get to move forward and do something about it. But where did that come from? And that idea that I think he also felt ashamed of himself that he didn't reach these benchmarks that only he could know about.
Yep. Yeah. This is exactly what I'm saying in my work over and over and over again, and it's so freaking sad. We all feel shame. It's like shame is the bedrock of the human psyche in terms of self-concept. Unless you go to a society where there is none of those standards. But it's so rare that there's no point in even talking about it, because the whole modern world is based on shame.
And I like the way you also say, one of the best ways to change that too is to own it. Hey, if you feel ashamed, what do you feel ashamed about? Why? Well, what do you say about embracing that uniqueness about yourself?
Oh, yeah. So we get into ping pong matches, is what I watch on all relationships, but it's super fun to watch with couples, because when we feel shame, which automatically happens within us, if we're in a conflict, most of us go into a space of shame. But what we do is we deflect that shame. So let's say that I got a friend, and that friend borrows something without asking me. Now, I get upset with that friend. If I go up to them and I say, well, I don't like the fact that you borrowed that thing without asking me, they're going to immediately feel shame. But instead of owning it and saying, okay, now I feel like a bad person because I feel like I shouldn't have done that and I did that, and that's so embarrassing. That would be owning the shame. What they will do is like, well, how can you be such a crappy friend that you would mind me borrowing something? And then I would, instead of me being like, oh, okay, well, that just made, now I feel ashamed of being a bad friend. Maybe I am a bad friend, which is where I'm actually going. I'll deflect the shame again and say something like, well, how is it even remotely okay? Were you raised in a barn? How can you think that that's okay? And then this ping pong match of deflection of shame goes back and forth. And so there's no way for us to really create the relationship. The relationship can be created, and we can connect them for what's true about us if we're owning the shame, which is extremely vulnerable, because shame is about, I am a bad person. So owning, when we're in any kind of a conflict, how I feel that I'm bad right now is a really great step in the direction of connection. But most people don't take that, of course, because it's scary as hell.
And it's funny because I'm reminded of a time, too, in 5th grade, one of these 3 schools that I visited just recently, and that was that last school that really made a difference for me anyway. And he was an ex-World War II veteran, major in World War II. And I'll never forget something that he said. He says, whenever you point your finger out at someone to blame for what happened to you, you have to remember there are 3 fingers pointing back. And at the time in the 5th grade, I didn't really totally understand what he was saying, but over the years, I just kept meditating on that, and I started realizing, to a degree, he's really right, that you're 3 times more responsible for why that happened than that person out there you're blaming for why it happened. And I thought, if I could accept that, then maybe I'll be more empowered to actually see what my actions are. Now the question is, why am I acting the way that I am? And you really start stripping away or peeling away the layers of the onion, you will, and that's the backbone of your book. Hey, get to who you are. What's going on here? And that could be a lot easier than you think it is, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. What's difficult about it is being willing to feel those uncomfortable emotions, because looking at the truth or looking at reality seldom feels super freaking amazing. We're usually in our coping mechanisms trying to get away from reality, because reality, swallowing reality hurts in some way. But I wish that people could develop the willingness to be uncomfortable, because the minute that you can go in the direction of that, awareness is very quickly to follow. It's not like you're going to be wallowing around in pain and not know what the answer is. It's like you go in the direction of that uncomfortable look at reality, and you instantaneously have more awareness. But our axis of power for changing our reality that we live in for the better is founded in that reality. So we have to accept reality. That incredibly vulnerable, uncomfortable space is everything they've been looking for. The people who are the best people that you've always wanted around you, the job that feels like an authentic expression of who you are, that you wake up for because you just love doing it. All of the stuff that we all want as people is on the other side of that self-awareness, if we're willing to feel the discomfort.
Now, another ultimate pillar, it's one of the three pillars that you talk about in your book, Anatomy of Loneliness, is that of fear. Let's talk
Mm.
about that, for instance, and what you mean when it comes to fear.
To fear something is quite simple. It's to push something away from yourself. We only push something away from ourselves when we feel like it is going to pose some kind of threat to us. So the second that I feel like something's going to pose some sort of a threat to me, my needs or my desires, I push it away from me. So the way that shame is to push something internal away, fear is to push something external away. And obviously you can't push something away, like I said, making yourself isolated, which is how that applies to the isolation thing. But the way that we have dealt with fear is absolutely horrible. We bulldoze the hell out of it. I mean, exposure therapy is everything. We grow up in a world where it's like, well, too bad you're afraid, go towards it. And what I'm proposing is that in order to stay integrated so that we don't feel a sense of loneliness, we have to develop this attitude of moving forward with the fear. Because our whole society is all about transcending the fear. I mean, literally, listen, next time I'm sort of cursing everyone who's listening to this, because next time you listen to people talk about fear, you're going to notice that like 99.999% of the discourse, how to get over fear, how to get rid of fear, fear is the enemy. But when we do that, we're making an enemy of the part of us that is in fear. So if we start to address fears of a very small child that's crying for our support, the way that we deal with that is not to shove it away and make it wrong and try to get rid of it. We bring it closer and we move forward with it. So it's almost like we're picking up the little baby who's crying and saying, I know you're scared, I'll be here with you, and moving forward with it. It's a totally different, it seems like a subtle nuance, but it's a completely different energy. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to create that integration within ourselves that makes it so that we're transcending loneliness, isolation, and not fragmenting within society, power 20.
Yeah, I really like what you described there, especially when you say you move in and toward it, instead of bulldozing it down or trying to repel from it. And proof of the pudding on that is all the anti-aging commercials. Oh boy, we're afraid of getting older. That's so bad. I mean, the fact that you have is not such a bad thing. But one of the examples, when you talk about moving into it and feeling that feeling and just keep taking your steps forward anyway, I think sometimes that's why we revere athletes and actors, people in entertainment, is because they face one of the biggest fears that I think most people have. In fact, the number one fear is public speaking, so it is said. Mm-hmm. People would rather die than speak in public. So we revere these people that put themselves up on the stage, exposed in front of everybody, and you get to see those flaws, but you get to be also a bystander who doesn't get to experience what that's like. Yep. And a unique example to talk about what you're talking about, moving into it, I remember many years ago having an IRS bill, and I'm taking a look at this, and I could just feel the fear in me. I mean, it must have been like one of those animals they put into a cage to feed another animal that knows its day is numbered. And I'm sure we probably, maybe once in a while, some of us have seen the poor little mouse that's huddled in the corner. It just knows it's done. And that's kind of what I was feeling that day. But I thought, but I'm going to deal with this. And I was even listening to my own thinking in this whole thing. Now, there were two ways that I could go about this in retrospect as I think about what you just said here. A, I can move into the fear. I could talk to this person and not make up a story, but just say, here's where we're at, what can we do, which is the choice that I made. Or I could take the position of a victim, and you see this in a lot of people. You're yelling, you're screaming, you're calling them names, and nothing really gets resolved. Okay? And I think that's when you see fear the most, is when you hear either verbal or you see physical confrontation. That's true fear in action, correct? That's when you're bulldozing it away, do you think?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
And in this case, what I did is I felt it. I called this person, and I said, look, I can give you a story. I know you hear a lot of them. And I can tell you simply, this is what actually happened, and I'm not a victim here. What can we do about this? She says, hold on just a minute. This is how quick this conversation went. Not even a minute later, she came back and she says, we've decided to go ahead and abate that tax fine. What does that mean?
Gosh.
She says, we're erasing it. It doesn't exist anymore. I'll be sending you a letter that confirms we're doing that today. And this was a pretty hefty bill. And I said, really? And she said, yeah. And I said, what's your name? And she says, gave me your name. I said, I wished I could hug you and kiss you right now, but the beauty is my fear is stepping into it, as I was saying, I'm willing to step into reality exactly as it is and take it on.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out to be a hell of a lot kinder than I thought it was.
Yeah, that's usually the case, yeah.
Now, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good
Okay.
example.
I wanted to be sure that I could contrast, how we deal with it, or one way or step into it, the other. So.
No, I love it. I love the way that you're giving these practical examples. It's awesome.
Well, you give a lot of those in your book. It's just a matter of picking out the right ones. Now, what would you say now, especially with family, as we just have a few minutes left, but there's one of the tough ones, too, when you find that you've separated from family. There could have been a blowout maybe at a Thanksgiving dinner or whatever, and maybe you don't talk to somebody for a year, 2 or 3 years, and you decide, I'd kind of like to reconcile this, but somehow that other member you want to reconcile just isn't having it. So is there a responsibility, do you feel, on both sides to be able to put closure and maybe move forward?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff you can do in terms of your own personal growth and your own personal resolution without somebody. But if you want to have a relationship, it does take two. If you want a relationship, it's like the way that I like to give people an analogy. To have a relationship is like to imagine a kiddie pool in the middle of two people standing on either side. The relationship happens in the middle of that kiddie pool. So one person has to get in, and then the other person has to get in. If they don't get in, then you're in that kiddie pool by yourself, and you can't drag them in, and you can't keep them in. So it's about a personal commitment on behalf of two people to get in that kiddie pool. So the most profound thing that we can really commit to in terms of our own personal desire is to attract people into our reality and choose people to be close to in our reality who are going to commit to being inside that kiddie pool even when it's difficult. Because you can't force somebody into that commitment.
Fascinating stuff, and this is a great book for people actually to be able to do, some personal archaeological digs and figure out, where do I take myself from this point here? And I would have to ask, in your experience, what would you say the most important key or one of the most important keys to happiness is in your eyes?
I feel like the most important key to happiness is to continue to go in the direction of what feels good. It sounds super straightforward, but it's not very straightforward to most people. We live in a society where we are trained against our own emotional guidance system. So we always have a reason why we can't go towards what feels good. But we need to continue to follow our joy and sort of deal with and face with the blockages that get in the way of that. So let's say that my joy is being on stage and acting. Let's just pretend that's it. What I have to do is I have to really face the reality of the blockages that might be in the way of me choosing to do that in order to move forward. I can't let those blockages completely derail my life path. And I cannot live my life according to another person's decision about what I should or shouldn't be doing for whatever they've decided to say for their joy. And people are very hesitant to be authentic enough to follow their own personal guidance system. But I'm literally not kidding. If people could just take little steps in the direction of their joy every day, you would arrive at a place where your purpose fell in your lap. You would arrive at a place where you have the people, places, and circumstances that you've been wanting. So that's the single biggest key to happiness. And one of the questions that I love to give people to ask themselves in order to make that an easier process in each situation that you get into, any situation to switch for, you want to ask yourself, what would someone who loves themselves do?
Boy, there's an interesting question. I like that very much. Teal, it's wonderful talking with you, and I wanted to let the listeners know here that you can also discover more by going to YouTube, and you have a series called Ask Teal. That's T-E-A-L, Ask Teal. You got more than almost 500,000 subscribers on your YouTube channel. You got more than 50 million views, and you're just kind of going crazy on social media and things like Facebook and Instagram. So, if you want to kind of get an experience, or you want the experience of the kind of work that you do, even if you just want that free sample, as we were talking about earlier, there's a place you can start. Or as I suggest people, if you really want to make these changes, make a commitment and spend a little money, and this book isn't that expensive.
Well, I got a special offer for people today.
There you go.
My special offer for the people who are listening to your show is that if people listen to this and they and when they order the book, The Anatomy of Loneliness, if you send your proof of purchase to gifts@tealswan.com, then you'll instantly get a free audio version of my other book called The Connection Process, which is the perfect adjunct to Anatomy of Loneliness, because connection process is a process that tells you how to connect to the internal world of another human being. It's a super fun process.
Absolutely, and it sure is, because, that's the fun process of life, is discovering who you are, and at the same time kind of discovering and getting to know who other people are. And sometimes when we get to that point, life really has a whole heck of a lot of color, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Teal, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thanks for having me so much.
Well, thank you to the listeners out there. Again, the book is The Anatomy of Loneliness. It's how to find your way back to connection. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.